Okay. Whoa! No, that's okay. Okay, so we were talking about the yanas as epistemic or mentalistic correlates for what Nibbana is not, and we were just talking about the extended cosmology of samsara as a metaphysical correlate for what Nibbana is not. So, to conclude this section, I just want to say, look, these yanas in these realms are all impermanent, fraught with misery, and egoless, or anicca, dukkha, and anatta. And I'll explain what those are all about a little bit. Nibbana is not to be identified with any state of consciousness, no matter how finely tuned or abstract. Okay? And further, it can't be identified with any ontological realm. So, there's one last thing, and this will answer, I think, a point that was raised by a fellow during the break, and also your point as well. Why all this philosophy if you didn't want us to over-philosophize? So this discourse that the Buddha has with the monk named Agivasena Veshagata will help us understand where the limits of philosophizing are. Okay? So during this talk, this monk asked him about 10 questions, which pretty much span the entire gamut of what we're talking about. So he asked, is the cosmos eternal or is it not eternal? Is it finite or is it infinite? Is the soul and the body the same thing or are they different things? Does the Buddha exist after death? Does he not exist after death? Does he both exist and not exist, or does he neither exist nor not exist? And in response to these questions, the Buddha says, these are, I'm supposed to change it. It's supposed to say thicket. It says ticket. It's not a thicket. It's thicket. These are the thicket of views, a wilderness of views, a contortion of views, a vacillation of views, a fetter of views. They are beset by suffering, by vexation and despair, and by fever, and they do not lead to disenchantment, to dispassion, to cessation, to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to Nibbana. So, what this dialogue shows us, I think, is that the classical epistemic and metaphysical questions about mind and reality that the West and other traditions all over the world are so concerned with, in trying to construct their architectonic map of the world, their theory of everything, has very little to do with the Buddhist path. That which is not conducive to direct knowledge of the Four Noble Truths with a view to the realization of Nibbana, the elimination of misery, is irrelevant. So, I hope that so far I've made it at least somewhat clear that Nibbana is not structured in such a way as to be that useful as an idea in our sort of classical, metaphysical, and epistemic ideas. However, there is a point, the Buddha uses this term direct knowledge. Okay, this is an interesting term. What does that mean? Indirect knowledge, I think we can postulate as something like propositional reasoning, intellectual understanding, that which can be ascertained through the conclusions of arguments. The final goal is beyond this, right? But the reality of Nibbana can be understood as it is in itself, not from a direct, deductively valid argument, but through experience, right? And this direct knowledge is unmediated by language or concepts. But I'm thinking maybe the phenomenological tradition is a better arm of the Western tradition to appropriate here, because it's concerned with experience. It's trying to talk about what experience is like and what's going on. What is the structure of experience? So an important point to sort of just start off is that the concern of phenomenology is transcendental. Okay, and what this means in rough terms is that it is trying to elucidate invariant structures of the mind which help to constitute a world in a metaphysically agnostic sense. So it's saying that what experience of the world is like is intrinsically wrapped up with mind, but they don't want to say, yes, but now we're living in Berkeleyan idealism. Right? You're just trying to say that we live in a world where experience of the world has to do with the structure of the mind, and there is no such thing as an authentic, mind-independent explanation of the world. Mind is constantly implicated in the world. So the Buddha explains many different mental structures that I'm going to talk about now, okay? And many of these have explicitly phenomenological thrust, and this is the gray area I was talking about earlier. So I'm going to spend some time now just talking about those different constructs, very briefly, but enough to sort of give you a flavor of like points of convergence and divergence. And then I'm going to talk about Nibbana and how I think it can and cannot be appropriated to a phenomenological framework in the Western sense. So the five khandhas, again, this is probably the most important one. Like the aim of Western phenomenology, these khandhas explicate structures of the subject which help it constitute a world. But there's a strong difference, okay? And that is that there is a really important sense in which the khandhas are metaphysical, in the sense that he's trying, when the Buddha talks about khandhas, he's talking about what a person is. Right? He's not talking about bracketing the natural attitude in order to understand a different level of the world. He's like, no, as far as your subjectivity is concerned, it is exhausted by the khandhas. What a human being is 5 khandhas constantly arising and passing away, and that's it. So it's, in that sense, it's not really transcendental. There's a transcendental dimension, but it's subtly different. So it's a gray area, right? There's a guy named Lustas. He wrote a book called Buddhist Phenomenology. He argues that all of this stuff is just pure phenomenology, right? There's an extent to which that's an authentic interpretation. But the Buddha is trying to diagnose a problem, right? In order to diagnose that problem, he has to give an exhaustive account of what the symptoms are, okay? So the goal of the 5 khandhas is to make clear there's no substantial persistent self or soul which possesses the thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that we have, okay? There's only the arising and passing away of the aggregates, okay? And so in a sense, this is a metaphysical claim about selves. That is, they don't exist, right? So there are also these 2 really important structured, sort of conceptual structures that I want to touch on. They're more psychological than phenomenological, but I sort of just tucked them in here because they're sort of the bread and butter of Buddhist meditative practice, okay? They're the 10 virtues, or paramis, and these are more like a virtue ethic. But there's a phenomenological sense in which they you know, especially things like equanimity and truth and wisdom. We talked about those already a bit, wisdom especially, right? Those things they're in some sense constitutive, but this is more of a virtue ethic for the Buddha, right? We need to develop these qualities we need to really develop them in great quantity in order to get to where we're going, right? And then the 7 enlightenment factors, or the bojjhangas. These are awareness, the proper investigation of phenomena, energy, bliss, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. Now, especially the second one there, Dhamma Vikaya, the proper investigation of phenomena, there's a strong phenomenological thrust there, right? Phenomena in the classical phenomenal noumenal sense of phenomena. And we have to understand the phenomena of mind and matter properly, with right discernment, okay? And that's a phenomenological point. But in conjunction with these others, it's also clear that we're talking a little bit more about positive psychology and the kinds of mental traits that we need in order to develop a meditation, right? So all I want you to take away from this is that we've got points of touch, right? Points of convergence, but important points of divergence. Very important, right? So, and you know, the proclivity of comparative research is to, you know, emphasize all the similarities. Look, it's all like this, it's all the same. It's just like, no, it's not. It's very different and the same. And if we could just be aware of that, then I think the project can unfold in a more responsible manner. So with these ones, the bojjhangas especially, right? These are more like, you know, guides for meditative contemplation rather than invariant structures which constitute the world, right? So this last one that I already mentioned very briefly, the tilakkhana, the 3 marks of existence. This is the closest I think that we get to a phenomenological construct. They are anicca, impermanence, the constantly changing nature of reality, dukkha, the fact that reality is suffering, and anatta, that it is essentially egoless. Now, these 3 elements constitute an exhaustive schema for the exploration of all phenomena and share a similarity with Western phenomenology, as both are interested in what kind of structures underpin our experience of various phenomena of the world. Okay? But the important difference is that the Western construct is termed with invariant constitutive structures, okay, that make experience possible for us, right? Whereas the tilakkhana says that all phenomena are highly variant, right? That is impermanent, and as such are a source of misery, and insofar as we develop craving towards that, is constantly changing, right? And that when this insight is properly understood with regard to ourselves through the khandhas, egolessness is comprehended, anatta. Okay. This tilakkhana, this system, is agnostic with regards to the transcendental term, and is concerned with the actual nature of phenomena rather than what makes them possible for us. Right? Because there's a certain extent to which the phenomenological thrust sort of reifies the subject as a witness of the world, and then tries to explicate the structure that makes the experience of the world possible. Right? Now, certainly there are non-egological accounts of consciousness in the phenomenological tradition. I'm not trying to commit phenomenology to any one view, but the tinge of Western, that Western tinge is there. And I think there's overlap, but there's divergence, and being aware of that is all I ask. So, having gone through those basic structures, we can now come back to Nibbana and try and understand the extent to which it can be properly phenomenologized, if at all. So it is phenomenological in the sense that it can only be properly understood insofar as it's an experiential reality,